Hey everyone, Warwick's here. With BfA ending in 8 weeks as of this recording, and everyone dies looking towards Shadowlands, I wanted to take a step back and look at the journey that each class had in BfA. Today, we're doing the last class left in this series, the Rogue. If this is your first retrospective video, first off, welcome. I encourage you to check out the rest of the series. It'll be linked in the upper right hand corner right about now-ish. Kind of get to see my evolution as a video maker during this series, so laugh at the early videos and give me feedback. Before we shadow step into the Rogue specs, I just wanted to note that you are looking at low-level Rogue footage because I don't have one at 120. Rogue was the hardest class for me to get into this expansion as seen in the melee DPS rankings video. It'll be linked in the description below. It doesn't really change the information that we're going to discuss about the class though. So let's get into Rogues. We're going to do their specs in alphabetical order, so Assassination Rogue is first. Assassination Rogue is the more methodical spec of Rogue. It's come far from its roots as the burst spec with cold blood as its major cooldown during its Burning Crusade time frame. Now it has Vendetta, Poisons, Bleeds, and a slower playstyle that I think appeals to a lot of people. In Mythic Plus, this playstyle was underrated, I think. It did a fantastic single target damage for most of BfA, especially in the middle of the expansion. This made it pretty valuable on tyrannical weeks where your boss fights were going to be much longer than your trash fights. Its AoE damage was a little above average, but it wasn't great. The biggest downside to Assassination versus, say, Outlaw Rogue is that the ability to vanish was more of a DPS-centric cooldown for Assassination. For Outlaw, it was more utility because of the way their damage kits were designed. Outside of that, though, all the normal Rogue utility was there. Cloak of Shadows, Feint, Smoke Bomb, Tricks of the Trade. And the reason that Assassination wasn't necessarily as highly represented was just more about the AoE versus single target damage. It just didn't compete with Outlaw Rogue when it came to AoE damage. The grade is an A-. In Raid, it was a very solid pick throughout the expansion until 8.3. In Uldir, Battle for Jazara Lore, and Eternal Palace, they were almost an automatic right-in to your melee group right next to Havoc Demon Hunter for raid slots. In 8.3, you saw Warriors, Demon Hunters, and in some cases Death Knights outpace them damage-wise, and then Assassination fell off some. They still had great defensives. All the mentioned ones earlier were still very valuable to keeping the Rogue alive as long as possible in Raid. Its utility was still pretty good, but not necessarily as fantastic. Tricks of the Trade was the biggest one. But they still did solid damage, and they had high damage uptime due to their dot-based playstyle of Poisons and Bleed maintenance. Even with their very tip-top end representation, talking top 10 guilds in the world, falling off in 8.3, I still think they filled many guilds' raid rosters because they were just always an acceptable choice. Their damage was always going to be pretty consistent, and you knew that a well-played Assassination Rogue was going to stay alive pretty long, so you didn't have to worry about losing their damage pretty early on in a fight. Grade in Raid is an A+, so the overall grade for Assassination is A. Assassination is one of the more well-realized specs. It nails the power fantasy that Blizzard wants it to have almost perfectly. Shadowlands doesn't change much about the spec, but I'm not convinced it needed much in the way of changes. I think Assassination is one of the more polished playstyles in World of Warcraft at this current time. It pretty much covers everything that the spec wants to do, even if I would prefer to see it go back to its more Burning Crusade roots as a big burst cooldown spec. And stacking poisons within Venom. But we're going to move on. We're going to move on now to the Outlaw Rogue. Outlaw Rogue, the combat rogue with a new coat of paint. Outlaw Rogue was the most fun rogue spec for me due to the RNG weirdness associated with Roll the Bones. The spec has a lot of the combat rogue fundamentals with a theme of Jack Sparrow. It's kind of how I see the spec. In Mythic Plus, they were the choice rogue specs for almost the entire expansion. Their AoE potential with Blade Flurry was impressively high. Couple that type of insane damage in AoE with a ton of mob control for a DPS, and they were staples for Mythic Plus comps all expansion. You had blind, kicks, stuns with kidney shot, just a lot of good utility. They were staples of MDI. They were staples of high keep pushing comps as well. And in Season 3 of MDI, you saw Triple Rogue being very common in MDI, the Triple Outlaw Rogue. Outlaw rogues appeared in all 4 seasons of Mythic Plus pretty prominently, with Season 4 being the lowest rogue representation just because of how Awakened works. It made rogues less necessary because of the way that Awakened works. Shroud of Concealment just wasn't as important. That said, Outlaw still kind of just did it all in Mythic Plus, even though you just pretty much spam rerolled, roll the bones until you got a buff that was good. I'm going to give it an S tier grade for Mythic Plus. In Raid, their RNG style of play was a bit more volatile. If you got a great opener with a good roll the bones opener, then you looked really good on the damage meters. If you didn't get one, then you sometimes struggled to recover. This Feast Famine gameplay style was overshadowed by the much more consistent Assassination rogue. Outlaw did well on tight-packed ad-style boss fights because their AoE potential was so powerful. However, in the long run, they just couldn't keep up consistently to match Assassination as the choice raid spec. I'll give it an average grade here of B. Overall grade is going to be an A. Outlaw Rogue suffered from the same thing that a few other specs did in this expansion. They were great in one aspect of PvE, but not necessarily in both. Roll the Bones being made a cooldown based finisher is probably a good thing for the spec, but I'm curious to see how they compensate for the RNG of getting a bad roll. Outlaw is definitely going to continue that Feast of Famine style of play, and I'm curious to see how that does to its representation in both Mythic Plus and Raid. And finally, we're going to go with the Sub Rogue. Sub Rogue was the worst spec in BfA. They had a couple of good moments early on, but a single change to an Azerite trait in 8.1 gutted the spec, and Blizzard never did anything to compensate for that gutting of the spec. This is the only spec in the series where I'm just going to combine Mythic Plus and Raid because the story is the exact same for the exact same reason. In Uldir, Sub-Rogues gained massive notoriety because their damage profile fit perfectly into one fight, Zul the Prophet. The Azerite trait Shuriken combo gave Shuriken Storm, which is Sub's AoE combo point generator, the ability to increase the damage of the next Eviscerate by 8%, and then initially it was nerfed down to 5%. This set up Sub as the funnel DPS spec, even more than Elemental Shaman and Unholy Death Knights. As a result, in both Mythic Plus and one fight in Uldir, grouping adds on a boss allowed Sub to really shine. In Mythic Plus, you had to pull around the Sub Rogue to make this spec work, and you had to ask other DPS to kind of play a more single target playstyle so that the Sub Rogue could contribute solid damage. So it definitely was flawed in some ways. In patch 8.1, Blizzard removed the Shuriken combo trait. They buffed Shuriken Storm by 6% additional attack power, but this just wasn't enough. The removal of this one trait killed the spec for the next 2 years. The grade in both is going to be an F. I'm breaking my own scale here. Normally I only bottom out at D tier. That said, Subtlety Rogue has a lot of changes. It didn't quite get overhauled, but it was very, very close to getting overhauled. And I think the specs changes are making it look really good, and it's generating a lot of buzz. Overall, 2 rogue specs were solid additions to a Raid or Mythic Plus team. Outlaw and Assassination didn't get many changes in going into Shadowlands, as Blizzard sees the specs being in pretty good positions. As I said earlier, Sub got some major changes and it started to generate some buzz, as possibly being the new Mythic Plus spec, with Assassination still kind of being the Raid choice spec. If you're a rogue main, you get 3 shots at a good spec, and I think you're going to have 3 solid choices to choose from that you can switch between to fit the content that you want to do, which I think is good for pure DPS specs. I like seeing pure DPS specs having to play, Sub and Mythic Plus, maybe Assassination and Raid, or Fire Mage in Raid, but you play Frost Mage in Mythic Plus, that sort of thing. I think it's good for those pure DPS specs, although Hunter a little bit different because they have 2 ranged and 1 melee. Anyways, how did you guys rate rogues this expansion? Leave a comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot to me. I really enjoyed doing this retrospective series. I hope you also had fun on the journey of the 12 classes in Battle for Azeroth and how they did during this expansion. We'll kind of maybe do a wrap-up series here. I want to do a video where I put all these specs on an actual tier list and look back and see if there's any specs I would change the grade for. Maybe we'll do that over the next few weeks. Until then, everyone, stay safe, wear your mask, and I will see you next time.